Hello and welcome to Understanding Obesity. My name is John Menzies. I'm a lecturer in Biomedical Sciences here at the University, and I'll be the lead instructor on this course. At the very outset, I want to tell you what we're not going to do. We're not going to learn about which diets might work. We're not going to be able to give you any tips on how to lose weight. Instead, we're going to look at the science around obesity, to look at some of the gaps in our knowledge, to address some of the myths and assumptions that people sometimes have around this problem. In later parts of the course, we'll go on to look at potential solutions to this problem. So we start off by defining what obesity is. It's defined clinically as an accumulation of body fat. Accumulation of fat to the level where it starts to endanger health. This is obviously a serious health problem, also a serious social and economic problem as well. But to understand how common obesity is, and to understand whether the interventions we'd like to make to prevent or reverse obesity work, we need a way of measuring it. The way we do that, most commonly, is using something called the body mass index, or the BMI.
To measure BMI, you need two pieces of information. You need your weight in kilograms and your height in meters. Armed with these two pieces of information, calculating BMI is very straightforward. Simply divide the weight by the height, but remember to square the height measurement beforehand. Most people will get a number somewhere between 20 and 30. Using my weight and height, I arrive at a BMI of 26.
BMI is categorized into different classes. 18.5 or less is considered underweight, 18.5 to 25 is considered normal weight, 25 to 30 is overweight, and anything greater than 30 is considered to be obese. Now, if you calculate your BMI, it doesn't necessarily tell you a great deal about your own body composition. It doesn't necessarily tell you how fat you actually are. Athletes, for example, especially those who compete in sports requiring a lot of strength and power, they tend to have very high BMIs, but the weight there is coming from skeletal muscle rather than fat. So BMI in individuals is not the best way to measure adiposity, but what it is very useful for is to look at populations.
This is data from the United States. It shows the prevalence of obesity, defined as a BMI between 30 and 35, in adults from the early 1960s to the middle of this decade. This is averaged data for men and women. What's very clear is that until the early 1980s, the levels of obesity were relatively low. Only around 15% of the population had a high body weight. However, from the 80s until the end of the 20th century, there was a remarkable increase in obesity levels. Now, they may have begun to stabilize, but the level has stabilized at a very high point, around 35%.
There are two other important points to take from this data. The first is that they don't include people who are overweight. This is just the obese population we're looking at. The second is that although levels are starting to stabilize, there's no evidence from the US or any other countries of any reversal in this trend. These levels are not looking like they're starting to drop.
But it's not just the US that has an obesity problem. This is data from 2014 from a selection of European countries. Again, we're looking at adults, and here obesity is defined as a BMI of over 30. Some countries, like Norway and Austria, still have relatively low levels of obesity, but others, like Greece, Malta, the UK and Hungary, have much higher rates, approaching those of the US. So it's clear that there is a range of obesity levels across the continent, but it's not known why some countries have lower rates than others.
It's also worth pointing out that there are some countries where the levels of obesity are still quite low, and China is a good example of that. But that may change because what China has is a large problem with childhood obesity. And if you're obese as a child, it's very likely that you'll be obese as an adult.
So we've seen that obesity is a problem in adults, and I've mentioned that childhood obesity is generally considered as an even more serious problem. Here's some data from the US, superimposed on the adults' data we've already seen. Good records start relatively late in 1994, but again, what's very clear is that childhood obesity is increasing over time. The most recent data puts it around 15%. That's over 11 million children who are obese before the age of 20.
There are numerous problems associated with obesity. There are health problems, social problems, and economic problems. Let's start first by looking at health.
These data show the striking relationship between BMI and diabetes and BMI and high blood pressure. Both these diseases are long-term conditions, can be debilitating, and can endanger the sufferer's life. The risk of developing diabetes, most commonly type 2 diabetes, which is the preventable form, increases hugely as BMI increases. Similarly, there's a strong relationship between BMI and high blood pressure.
So what about the social costs? It's becoming increasingly evident that there is a stigma associated with obesity. People often assume that obese individuals are lazier, less reliable, and more self-indulgent. But of course, there's no evidence to support those assertions.
These data are taken from a study looking at obesity stigma. Discrimination was evaluated by asking the participants whether they'd been discouraged from seeking higher education or not hired for a job, for example. Common day-to-day activities where body weight should be irrelevant. Overweight participants described relatively little discrimination, shown in light blue in the left-hand figure, but participants with a BMI of greater than 45 reported experiencing discrimination more often, shown in dark blue in the right-hand figure.
So it's clear that obese people can suffer from stigmatization, and there's evidence that they suffer discrimination in the context of employment and education. So there are great social costs to obesity, but let's look now at some of the economic costs.
This shows the breakdown of spending of the UK National Health Service. The total spent in the financial year 2006-07 was £81 billion, and of that, 38%, that's almost £31 billion, was spent on problems associated with diet and obesity, almost as much as was spent dealing with the huge health problems associated with smoking and alcohol.
As well as these direct costs, there are also large indirect costs, the cost of days lost at work through illness and so on. And even in a small country like Scotland with a population of only 5 million, the indirect costs of obesity add up to something like £1.4 billion every year. In the next film, Professor Gareth Lang, who's Professor of Experimental Physiology here and also the coordinator of the Nudge It project, will look into some of the myths and misunderstandings around obesity, look at the gaps in our knowledge. But before you watch the film, we'd like you to complete a questionnaire. It contains a few short, simple questions, shouldn't take you too long to do, and we'll discuss your responses later on in the course.